Hello, and this is going to be my half guide of skill add-on. So the most important thing I want to say is that this is not going to be a video that says, oh, you get this add-on for PvE and this for PvP or whatever. It's really going to be a discussion that's aimed at informing people in a way that will let them make their own educated decision regarding what add-ons will and won't work for them. Because add-ons are very individual, and you have to consider both the type of content you are enjoying as well as your own personal playstyle. And hopefully this will make a bit more sense soonsies, but actually, but before starting to do add-on things, one thing I want to mention is that, so you know how there are kind of three tiers of add-ons? You have the potato ones, like on Chain Lightning, extra damage to monsters plus 10, PvP damage plus 5, defense plus 10. Then you have the standard ones available on most skills, where it's going to be 15, 10. Yeah, it's like tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And then you have the highest tier on skills like Meteor Shower or Chilling Wave and Awakening. And a lot of people try to take the high tier ones no matter what. But this isn't always something I would advise, because if you have an extra damage to monsters plus 30 active and it has 0.01 seconds left before expiring, if you use one that has extra damage to monsters plus 20, it will not refresh or overwrite the almost expired tier 3, I will call it for now, add-on. So sometimes if you want to keep as much uptime as possible on your add-ons, it's not always the best idea to go with the highest tier one, especially in cases where percentage-wise it's not as big of a gain over the mid-tier. So that's just something to keep in mind, because a lot of optimizing add-ons has to do with uptime on the most crucial buffs. So I will start with PvE just because it's anything but one-dimensional, but it is a little bit more simple than figuring it out for PvP, and a lot of the ideas will carry over. So anyways, when I'm starting to gather things and pull them to me, I will usually be using my AoE skills as they're approaching. I was going to use my normal Earthquake, but I think I have Evade on. Yep. So usually I will want to... a few things to keep in mind. First of all, if you're putting debuffs that will affect the target you hit on skills, you don't want to put them on skills that will only hit one or two things, possibly like the first AoE that you use as things are grouping up, or a single target skill. It's best to keep things that aren't going to hit a lot of targets to things that only buff you instead of debuff them. Another thing for witches and wizards is the skills that you use that have your large AoEs have low or no critical hit rate. This doesn't have any. This doesn't have any. This has 50 in PvE. This has 50, I think. Yep. So one important thing to keep in mind is that percentage-wise, you will gain the most damage with critical hit rate over all add-ons if your skills do not have 100% effective critical hit. So usually what I will do is on the first AoE that I'm likely to use, I will put critical hit rate, plus 20%. I have that on Earthquake on my normal setup for PvE, I believe. Now, other than that, that one's more situational. Like, I definitely wouldn't put it on Earth Response, because I use that to position before killing, and then most of the high damage stuff here is 100% crit. So it's very important to keep things like that in mind. Just because 20% critical hit rate is really good does not mean it's going to be good no matter what. It's like it would be pretty much wasted if I put it on a skill right before a bunch of 100% crit things. So anyways, first I will discuss how much different ones benefit you. Percentage-wise, extra damage to monsters plus 20 will be somewhere between 5 and 7% extra damage, depending on your level of gear. All evasion, I'll just go in order. Attack cast speed plus 7%, depending on how you want to look at that. No matter how you want to look at that, it's very important. It's a little bit harder to really quantify in terms of percent extra damage when you look at everything, but I do put it as the highest level of importance along with extra damage to monsters. All evasion minus 4%. If you're fighting things that like Crypto Resting Thought with obscenely high evasion, then that's going to be significant, but that will depend very much on what you're doing. Assuming that something has a reasonable but not crazy dodge rate against you, it will probably be roughly equal to or a bit less significant than things like extra damage to monsters plus 20. Forgot what I was doing. Oh yeah. Should probably structure this a bit differently. Okay, I'm going to restructure it now. Because I scrolled down to here and then I realized that one of the most important things that people unfortunately go wrong on a lot of times is they overestimate how important these are. Your critical hit damage plus 3% per instance of critical is only going to get you a little over 1% extra damage, equivalent to 4 AP maybe. Your back and down attack damage per instance of back and down attack will be a little bit more significant than this, but still it's negligible to the point where if you get them at all, they should be your absolute lowest priority, also considering that they have very low uptime. Now, your all DP minus 15 for 10 seconds. That tends to be a somewhat similar damage gain to all damage to monsters plus 20%. So I would also put that as a very, very high level of priority. However, again, make sure that if you do this all DP minus 15, that it's on something that is going to tag pretty much everything you hit. On my main, I have it on residual lightning as usually after I get my pull together, I will position behind them, and then residual lightning is the first large AoE I use when everything's positioned. I'm actually going to go on my main really quick, just to show my add-ons and explain why I do it the way I do it. This will hopefully do a bit to explain the thought process that goes into to all of this. So, Earthquake. Critical hit rate plus 20% for 7 seconds. I do that because I usually will follow it with other things that have a non 100% critical hit rate with Frigid, with Voltaic, and with Equilibrium Break. And I use this as a very early opener. I also put extra damage to monsters plus 20 on it, just because that's a high priority one, and it's a self buff instead of a target debuff. And it's likely that even though this is an AoE, it won't be hitting a lot of things at once. Then after that, Voltaic, I have my defensive add-ons on this. Similar reasons, I use it early on, and I really like my defense. And it's all self buffs and no target debuffs. Then I will follow up with Frigid Fog, if applicable, before positioning. Um, I don't always use this one, but I very often will. And I say that because it will explain some of the overlap. Actually, I use it most of the time now, but anyways, all accuracy plus 4%, another self buff, and attack casting speed plus 7%, which is another one I consider very, very high priority. The reason I don't put it on one of the ones before it is I find it unlikely that while things are approaching, it's going to make the difference between me doing one more large AoE skill. But anyways, then I will position, residual lightning, extra damage to monsters plus 20. We'll refresh the one from Earthquake, or if I end up not having Earthquake, which happens sometimes, I want to put this up before I do all of my really hard-hitting skills. All TP minus 15 for 10 seconds to target. I put this on Residual Lightning because this is the first of my really, really hard-hitting skills I use. And it's also a large AoE, so I'm likely to hit pretty much everything in my pack with it. And then following that is Lightning Storm. I refresh my attack casting speed plus 7% for 7 seconds after it's used with Frigid Fog. And then after that, a lot of times I will use my fire sequence. I don't have any add-ons on that because I seldom use that before I use lightning. And I should have all of the important add-ons up while I'm using that. And then after that, if in need of more damage, I will either use multi-arrow or more AoE skills, depending. But the reason I put these two on multi-arrow, even though by the time I use it, I'm likely to have the attack cast speed plus 7 and extra damage to monsters plus 20 for 7 seconds up, is just because I use multi-arrow so regularly for filler damage, pretty much no matter what the situation. So putting the two self-buff add-ons I deem most important on multi-arrow just seems to make sense. And now to address why I have so much overlap, and I don't use any of the critical hit damage plus 3%. It's mainly because the damage from that does tend to be very negligible. And I would sacrifice uptime depending on how messy or weird my combo is. It gets kind of weird, especially with the new Hatun spot. But anyways, from lack of uptime, it's like I don't use the same skill sequence every single time. It's highly situational. So from lack of uptime on the ones that are ultimately more significant, it would be detrimental to my overall offensive power, I guess you can say. Now, the critical hit rate and the back attack, let's say, assuming 100% instance of back attack, starts to be a little more significant. But the reason I don't value back and down attack nearly as much as consistent damage is because your kill speed is usually governed by the last thing. Your kill speed is usually governed by the last thing that dies, and the last thing that dies is likely to be the one that is not receiving a lot of special attacks, like Hystria, the thing that doesn't get CC'd and just turns around and eats front attacks the whole time. Usually a gross Bolton or something. But anyways, now if I didn't use any defensive add-ons, I would use either back and crit or down and crit, depending on the spot, probably. But defensive-wise, this just benefits me so much more than the other thingies will offensive-wise. So yeah, that's why I I go with this? And again, this is something that's very specific to how I do my skill sequences and to how I fight. Um, Everyone is going to do things a bit differently, but the main things to keep in mind, the main takeaway is you want to build your add-ons such that you have maximum uptime on the ones that benefit you the most at the times they benefit you the most. And you also want to make sure that if you're doing ones with target debuffs instead of self buffs, that you're not using the target debuffs on ones that are only going to hit a few things. So, like my multi arrow, even though I use it very regularly, and even though LTP minus 15 for 10 seconds is very strong, I'm likely not going to be hitting a lot of things with it, and I'm likely not going to be using it until much later on in my sequence. So, yeah, um, that is very important and nice to keep in mind. Now, let's say if I were grinding a spot where everything was pulled from me already and they were in super tight clumps. I might not be using my lightning first, and I probably wouldn't be using any AoEs because damage per unit of time is a lot lower on AoEs. In fact, I'd probably be using my fire first. Because fire, I mentioned clump tightly because fire doesn't hit in quite as large of an area. But anyways, so if that were the case, these would be structured differently. I would have the high or the high offensive bonus ones, like attack cast speed plus 7% and all damage against monsters plus 20 and all DP minus 15 on the fire skills that I use first. So again, please don't just copy the ones I do if you're looking for PvE add-ons. Look at your specific style, look at how you fight, and base it off of that. Let's say if you're grinding a low level area, and instead you use Halfguide, just because it's very good at low level areas, large AoE in front of you, and short cooldown. It might even make sense depending on the area. I had this for a while when I was at certain spots to put move speed on it, just as it helps with some pack to pack mobility. So again, it's ultimately looking for uptime on whatever helps you grind faster, which doesn't even have to be what helps you do the most damage. But yes, it's very, very, very situational and extremely individual. And also for another example of how it's, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, another example of how it's situational. When things are grouping up, for me, I will commonly not use equilibrium break, but instead just use something like voltaic to frigid, and then position and kill. So with that in mind, I don't have any add-on on equilibrium break as there's a very high likelihood I won't be using it at all before positioning, but I will almost always use voltaic and frigid. And Earthquake is on cooldown a lot of the time, but I'll get my 20 PPE damage quickly anyways from residual lightning, and if I'm not using as many of the things that benefit from crit, well, you know, crit becomes a little bit less important. But yeah, that's just a little bit of the thinking behind add-on choice. And luckily, this isn't even just specific to Wizard. This is stuff that can be considered no matter what class you play. And now let's talk about PvP ones. Luckily, a lot of the ideas carry over. So, and this is something where actually I'll just go back on my. No, I don't know. Oh, I have an idea. I'm dumb. I will just here. You'll see what I'm gonna do. Probably go back on that wizard eventually, anyways. To be honest. So I shall just do this. PvP successions. Very defensive, by the way, but and again, this all comes down to how I like to play. This is probably drastically different from how most people would choose theirs, but again, it all comes down to your individual choices. Now, one thing I want to bring up with PvP add-ons is for target debuffs, if everyone else, and if you're doing group PvP and everyone else on your side has the exact same ones, then it might be a lot more beneficial if it's mixed up a little bit. If every single person does all evasion minus 4% and attack cast speed minus 7%, then maybe PvP AP minus and maybe move speed minus might start to be quite helpful. Maybe all accuracy minus might start to be very helpful. So yeah, that's just one thing to keep in mind because these, of course, won't stack on your targets. Now, offensively in PvP, actually, I guess I'll do things like 1v1 separately from other things. I don't know, I'll figure it out as I go. You definitely don't want extra damage to monsters. PvP damage plus 10, 2.5 to 3.5% more damage, depending. All defense plus 15, you're going to be made a little more tanky than the PvP damage plus 10 will make you more anti-tanky. Wait, that doesn't make sense. Will make them less tanky because you're killing them. Okay, you know what I mean. Maybe. Hopefully. All accuracy plus 4%. That depends solely on what your hit rate against them is. That could be very significant against a full defensive build, or it could do nothing against a full DR offensive build. All evasion, same thing, but inverse of that. Attack cast speed plus 7%. I probably value this above anything else offensively in PvP. And you really will probably want to go for high uptime on this just because not just the damage, but the defensive and offensive utility that you get from attack cast speed. So this, I'd say, is the very highest level of importance. Now, same rule for PvP with the target debuffs. Assuming you're doing group fights, you probably want them on large AoEs that hit a bunch of things. And you also may want to strongly consider doing ones that not everyone else in your team is using. And for 1v1s, situational, for example, I will put things on poke skills depending. Like, for example, my Lightning Storm, I might do a lot of that kind of thing. So I choose this based on the fact that I'm likely using it when someone is not super close range before they engage. My Voltaic Pulse, I use this as a get off me kind of skill. And it's very likely to tag at least one thing if it's in a group setting, so I put my favorite defensive add-ons on this. Frigid Fog, kind of similar things. It's likely to hit a lot of people when I use it. Sometimes I will use it independently of Voltaic or Voltaic independently of this, so I put all evasion plus on both of them. Magic Arrow, this one, it's kind of a joke and kind of not. I use it to boop people, kind of. So yeah, that's why those exist on it. A lot of times I use it if I'm counter-griefing someone, and it's the only skill I can get off when they're running around. Should probably, but oh, I really wish that Chain Lightning had unpotato add-ons, because Chain Lightning has the issue of having the tier 1 add-ons. But anyways, in my Meteor, attack cast speed minus 10%, move speed minus 10%, just because I will use this to, of course, hit very large groups of people and from very long range. And for my Earth response, I use this defensively, reactively, whatever you want to call it, a lot when someone's pressuring, and a lot of times that ends up as the ability that I get off right before someone engages on me. And it's like, yes, a lot of these things have the same stuff, but that's just because of how critical I deem it, kind of, that I have the right thingies on my skills. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, I forgot to save it. I did change this one at one point to the evasion plus and the accuracy minus for them. I kind of go back and forth on a couple of these things, but anyways. Now for some more offensive ones. Now, even for someone who wants to do fully offensive, you may want to consider some level of defensiveness on them. Because there's a lot of, depending on how you think about it, there's also a lot of offensive value in doing things like debuffing someone's attack cast speed, especially if it limits their options regarding how they can really fight against you. But yeah, anyways. Let's see, what would I do offensively if I were 1v1ing someone? A lot of times the combo starter is Voltaic into Frigid. I would go for the strong offensive ones. All DP minus 15 is quite significant. And I'm always kind of back and forth between this, but whether I like to do these things at the start or the end of the sequence. I think the start makes most sense because 500 additional damage over 15 seconds is quite a lot. Percentage-wise, this adds more damage to your skill than anything else will. Well, only in PvP, not in PvE, just to make sure that's understood. So yeah, why not? And since these are very often chained, if I were to go full offensive, which I normally wouldn't, how they do something along the lines of this. The reason I like the attack, actually, no, I'm not going to do it on that. I will. Okay, so sometimes I would put it on frigid. My logic being, if they just eat the damage and the CC on both of them does not go off for one reason or another, one of the most valuable things you can do is leave them 7% crippled. However, sometimes I will use it instead on basically the last skill in my sequence. The reason being, that's when they're going to get up and be scary. Sometimes I'll use them on both. Okay, whatever. And you're going on this one too. I'm just explaining some of the ways of thinking when selecting add-ons. Meteor shower. Why not? If I'm in a group setting, I'm likely to use this right before an engage of some kind or another. So what are some nice self buffs for this? And a lot of the reason I'm not really thinking about using target debuffs is the likelihood of, in a group setting, the likelihood of a bunch of the people, if not all of them, having debuffs from other people tends to be very high. Or certain debuffs at least. So I like the idea of either going with less common debuffs or with self buffs. What do I have for these again? Okay, because I don't have my very important attack cast speed, I'm definitely going to be, oops. No, I do not want that one. Okay, the 10% on this. And I'm not going to worry about the lack of uptime, just because I figure that whatever I do probably is not going to last that long. Now, on something I often use regularly to poke from range, like residual lightning, that is where I would say, oh, maybe I want make sure good uptime on this. A lot of times that's right before starting a sequence of other skills, but yeah, anyways. I was dreaming a bit. I'll just say all evasion minus 4%, assuming you're likely to be fighting people with evasion builds. Could be nice. Really depends. That's hard to say. I like the consistency of this one, to be honest. And the reason I'm going with this is, well, I guess most people use the one that I don't use, so I'll probably go with that one. Where's my residual lightning? Oh, here's my residual lightning. So anyways, a lot of times you're going to be using it as part of a, I don't know, something or other. But it's something that there's a high likelihood you will be hitting someone with either before they engage on you or while you are trying to get away from them. And if you're going offensive, it makes sense too. It's like there are just so many options and so many valid things to consider when you're doing all of this, because I also really like the idea of putting the attack cast speed minus for them on this. You know what? I'm gonna switch it to, oops, I'm gonna switch it to that. That's how much I like it. The reason I'm switching it to this, I always like to, it's not just like on a whim. The reason is a lot of times when I'm using that ability, I'm actively trying to avoid them. I'm trying to stay away from them and keep them away from me. Um, so yes, that is kind of my thinking in doing that. And again, I'm not going with things like down attack plus and critical damage plus just because, and PvP even more so with special attack evasion being so prevalent now. It just kind of doesn't perform that well compared to some other things. What do I want now? I have mixed thoughts about Earthquake. And this will really depend on the person, but for me, I usually am not actually hitting people with Earthquake. I'm using it for the movement and then often canceling it with another skill. I'm usually not doing that to hit people. That's usually too slow for me, and it's usually a movement and movement only. But for people who will commonly take advantage of the damaging part of it, then it may make a lot more sense to do so. Oh yeah. And the other thing I forgot to see, there's so many things to consider that like I still change my add-ons in PvE even from time to time. I was also going to say, depending on how commonly you do like the typical voltaic, frigid, whatever else people usually do after it, you may want to consider the critical hit rate plus 20% on your opener, probably voltaic. Or let's say if you're likely to do the lightning sequence and hit someone with lightning storm before that, I guess it's not that common, but let's say if someone happened to do that, then maybe you'd want the critical hit rate plus 20 on the last skill there. But yeah, anyways, the point there is that damage-wise, nothing will benefit you more when using skills with low critical hit rate than having additional critical hit rate. Um, but yeah, it's hard to say with all this in mind. So why not do this? It's like there's so many people who will just say, "Oh yeah, this is the add-on setup to get for this." But no, there's so many different ways to approach this and so many different things to consider. Like instead, I'm going to change this to the all DP minus 15 and the all evasions minus 4%. And then I'm going to change this one to the critical hit rate plus 20%. And the wherever the bleed damage is. Here we go. Now let's see for here. What's another sensible one to use? Okay, thinking about it again for me personally. um, am likely to get, well, with how I do it, mine's a bit different. I think the point of this is going to be less about this is what you should do and more about this is the type of thinking that can help you decide what add-ons to get. So let's say for me, one common thing for me is going to be a bound followed by a knockdown, followed by a fireball explosion, followed by a damaging sequence. This. So because of that, I may want to, on my fireball explosion, um, because like, a lot of times I will try not to always use my voltaic and my frigid, because these are two of the most valuable kind of get off me safe hit traders. And while they are very strong when used in sequence with each other, um, it's also a big defensive hit to use. So for me, um, wherever my fireball explosion is, I will probably opt for the well, DP minus. I think I had that on frigid, did I? Yep. And the reason I do evasion minus for this is because I'm doing fireball explosion, which does not have any accuracy on it, and then following it with another very hard hitting skill with no accuracy, and then one with 10% accuracy. So if I'm fighting someone with reasonably high evasion, then naturally, you think this would be pretty nice um, to be able to do. Yeah, my kind of thinking so far with what I have offensively is if I'm going to drop something into a big crowd of people and then go in and nuke them as much as I can, I like to go for some very nice self buffs on Meteor and then go in. Start with something that's going to make these skills a lot more punishing, critical hit rate plus 20%, and overall damage to people from the bleed, especially in a group setting that could be very beneficial. I don't know how common bleeds are. And then frigid, more target debuffs, which will be very nice in general. For poke damage from range, residual lightning, I like things that debuff them. Again, there's a lot of offensive value in debuffing your target, and you're also buffing yourself as your attack has to be plus 7%. A lot of the utility there, offensive and defensive, comes from you being a lot more maneuverable and being able to do things quickly. And if you are kind of trying to kite someone with sequences of skills like that, then the debuff to them of their attack cast speed and the buff to you of your attack cast speed is very nice. Again, whether that's poke damage from range or you're actively trying to kite someone. So that's why I go with that. My fireball explosion, I put these debuffs on it because I'm commonly using it as the first hard hitting skill in my sequence after landing a knockdown to re-CC someone using Rob-on Fireball. And now for this one, what do I feel like? I personally don't use Earthquake enough. Okay. Since Lightning Storm is both something I use for poke damage and a lot of times one of the last or the last skill in my sequence when I'm comboing someone, I like to, again, for the last thing I do against them, um, what was I gonna say? I forgot. Oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. Um, Something about something. Oh yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I like to put somewhat annoying debuffs on them. I won't bother with the attack cast speed minus 7% because I have that on residual, which directly precedes this skill. But a lot of times after that, if I don't kill someone, I'm going to be, well, either I kill them and I don't care what debuffs are on them, or I'm going to be disengaging. Um, and I'm going to not really want them near me. So something like all PvP minus 10, and for myself, all defense plus 15. And again, I know it's an offensive build and this is a defensive thing, but um, the thing is, the amount that something like critical hit damage would benefit me offensively is so minuscule compared to how much something like this would benefit me defensively, that even if you're doing a fully offensive build, it may make sense to go for some things that benefit your defense, just like if you're doing a mostly defensive thing, it may make sense to go for some things that in one way or another benefit your offense. Like I don't completely neglect attack cast speed if I'm doing defensive ones, just because there's a lot of defensive value also in being able to cast things more quickly. So again, let's see. Oh yeah, and another thing, um, that I think I'm going to change about this, instead of all evasion minus 4%, because that's a pretty common one that people do, I would rather opt for an all accuracy plus 4% for me, even though it's 7 seconds instead of 10 seconds. Just because, again, remember that if everyone uses the all evasion minus 4%, if you're the 50th person who uses that and you hit only the same targets as others, that's not benefiting you or anyone else. But if you have the all accuracy plus 4%, 1v1 is essentially the same thing but 3 fewer seconds. And in a group setting, if someone already has this very commonly used debuff on them, it makes more sense to instead buff your accuracy. So yeah, and again, this is in mind. I don't say, oh, what will do the most damage under ideal circumstances. I say, with these situations, I am likely to find myself in. Um, what is going to be basically the most conducive to increasing my offensive power in that situation, or my defensive power in that situation, or decreasing their offensive or defensive power in that situation? So I look at the common sequences of skills that I use and the common general situations I find myself in, whether it's dropping a meteor and then engaging. That's not a typical one I find myself in, but I know it's very typical for a lot of people. Um, I figure getting someone with a bound and then following up with a Rabam Fireball knockdown into a Fireball explosion, it makes sense to put very strong offensive add-ons on this. If you're fighting DR builds, I'd probably substitute this with PvE, with PvP AP plus 10. I look at when I'm kiting someone and poking at them from range, um, I'm not interested just in doing as much damage to them as I can. If I can choose between increasing my damage slightly when I'm not even properly comboing them, when they're just standing up running at me, and debuffing variability in a way that limits them on what they can do to engage me and try to kill me, I'd rather do that. And with this one, the last skill in my sequence and a poke skill, I like the idea of buffing my defense and debuffing their offense a bit. Because if someone's pressuring me a lot and they're likely to get me eventually if I'm poking them from range, then that's helpful to me. And if they're on the ground, I'm trying to kill them and they're not quite gonna die, that's also helpful to me. So yeah, that's kind of the I'm actually glad I did it this way instead of just going over add-ons I already had for all of it. It's kind of figuring out a new approach, one that I normally wouldn't do because I normally go very, very defensive. It was nice to kind of be able to think through on the spot of a setup of add-ons I wouldn't normally use. But I hope this varied potato video was informative.